Well, according to an ancient Jewish custom that's still observed around the world today, every Friday night in Jewish observant homes, or in many observant Jewish homes, just before sundown on Friday, 2 candles are lit. I have here. Try not to burn down the church. No, I know. The 100th year of the church, I don't want to be the guy reminded. Goes down in history as the guy who burned it down. There it is. 2 Sabbath candles. Does anyone know why 2 candles? Altar, I was relying on you for this one. No. 2 candles because the Sabbath command is actually given to us in 2 forms. There's 2 different places in the Old Testament where Moses gives the people of God the 10 commandments, of which the Sabbath command is the 4th commandment. So in Exodus 20, which we read today, talking to the first generation of Israelites that have come out of Egypt, gathered at Mount Sinai, Moses gives them the 10 commandments, and we find this reason given for why they are to keep the Sabbath. God says to them, "In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." But to the next generation of Israelites, the ones that have spent 40 years in the wilderness, that are now gathered on the plains of Moab, ready to go in and take possession of this land, as Moses recites the whole law back to them, he begins again by giving them the 10 commands, which in both places are almost identical to each other, except for the Sabbath command. To this generation, he gives a different reason, or God gives a different reason why they are to observe the Sabbath command. And it's this: remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. 2 Sabbath commands, 2 candles. And today we have 2 stories out of Mark, both of them set on the Sabbath day. And what we find is Sabbath forms a really important backdrop to the early chapters of Jesus' ministry. Back in chapter 1, it begins in a synagogue on the Sabbath day with Jesus teaching and healing a man. And the very first part of his ministry now reaches a climax at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, on the Sabbath day. And once again we'll find Jesus back in a synagogue on the Sabbath healing a man. All of that means if we're going to grasp the significance of the kingdom of God that Jesus has announced and is beginning to preach, then Mark is saying we need to grab the significance of the Sabbath. Because Sabbath will teach us something about the nature of this kingdom, the vision of life, the vision of God's kingdom that Jesus is bringing to Israel. So as we come to these 2 stories, we need to spend some time unpacking the Jewish understanding of the Sabbath. For Jewish people, the Sabbath command was and is a really important command. It's a very important practice for keeping them in touch with God's work in the world. So we find the first Sabbath command, the one given to us in Exodus 20, is based in a reason that takes us back to Genesis, to the creation story. In Genesis 1, we discover God works for 6 days, he creates all things, and then on the 7th day, when all is completed and done, he rests. His work of giving shape to the world and filling it with life is complete. And one of the first things we learn about God is a worker. And so, it turns out, are the people he makes. In chapter 1, the express purpose for creating humanity is that they are to share in God's rule over all he's made. That's their work. That's their purpose. In chapter 2, we then find Adam and Eve in the garden. And we're told they've been put in the garden to work and to take care of it. Paul Stevens, who writes a fantastic little book called The Other 6 Days, summarises human work with three important in three important categories. The first is that humans are to be co-rulers over creation. The second is they're to be community builders. Just as God is in community, we are to build community. And the third thing is they are to share communion with God. Or the other way to say that is they're to be priests. This is human work. So the Exodus 20 Sabbath command really is there to help Israel keep work in its proper place. Both in the sense that work is right. Work is not simply a drudgery, it's what we're made for. But at the same time, our lives are not the result of our work. It's there to remind us that life is fundamentally a gift. So our day-to-day sustenance and our long-term prosperity in the world are not actually the well-deserved result of our hard labour. They're finally God's gift to us. Because our work is very much dependent on the fact that we live in this marvellous planet with this amazing biosphere that grows things, that offers up resources. All of this is a gift. It shouldn't be taken for granted. Some of you have probably seen that recent movie called The Martian with Matt Damon. He plays an astronaut that is accidentally left behind on Mars. So there he is in these little habitations, and he realises it's going to be a long time before anyone comes back to rescue him at all. And he's got to survive on this barren planet. So he sets about looking around at what's been left behind that he can use. And he comes up with a bag of potato seeds and a whole bunch of poo. Because Mars is like a national park. You know, you leave only footprints and you take all your rubbish home with you. So they've stored up all their poo. So he sets about with potato seeds and poo growing a crop of potatoes. He's set. But of course, Mars intervenes. A disaster comes about and that's wiped out. It's impossible for him to survive. And then he's got a real dilemma. It's a good reminder that we were made to live in this place, not in another place. That we're an integral part of this gift that God has given us. So, Sabbath then becomes a way of keeping in step with what God is doing in the world, with God's work. It keeps us alive to God's gift, and importantly, it keeps us from making our own work more important than it actually is. So it keeps us in a right perspective, both on our physical needs, our physical sustenance, and on our material wealth. All of it is gift. Well, the second time we hear the Sabbath command in Deuteronomy 5, that command is based not on the narrative of creation, it's based in the narrative of salvation, God delivering Israel from slavery. Now that's important. Slaves, you know, get no rest. They don't get a day off. And the work that slaves do is entirely done for the benefit of their owners. They get no benefit from their own work. They profit nothing from it. They are merely a possession, an asset that works for someone else's prosperity. And if you think about slavery, even slavery in today's world, the very nature of slavery is an ultimate corruption of what work is meant to be, of what God intends work to be. It's an ultimate desecration of the human image, of what it means to be created in God's image as workers. And it's finally an ultimate snub to God. Slavery is a complete desecration. And in the story of Israel, it's important to realise that freedom for them meant much more than simply the fact they would come to own their own land and they would come to enjoy the fruits of their own work. Because they were not only freed from something, they were freed into something. The whole structure of the book of Exodus begins a story in which Israel are slaves in Egypt. They are working for Pharaoh, building things for him. The book of Exodus finishes with Israel, who are now God's chosen people, and God calls them his son, And we find them building things again. They're instructed to build a tabernacle for God, a place where God can come and meet with them and they can live in communion with him. They can start to fulfill their creation mandate of working as God intended them to work. And so the second command brings freedom and creation together. And what we discover is we are free when we are fit into our intended, created place. We were created to belong to God. As one of the old catechisms put it, the chief end of man is to know God and to enjoy him forever. That means to rule with him, to build community and share community with him, to fulfill this priestly role, which is ultimately simply to be, not even do stuff. So the biblical description of freedom is freedom. Freedom is freedom to know God. That is what it means. Now, we have to pause for a minute and think about that a little, because in our society, we value freedom very highly, but we mean something very different, something that actually comes to mean the opposite of biblical freedom. Because much of what we mean to be freedom is good, right? We mean to live in security, to own the means of our own production, to have control over the means of our existence, to have choice, to be able to think and to reason without being compelled from somewhere outside. And that's all good. That's all part of what it means to be human. But too often than not, what we mean by freedom goes on to say freedom is the freedom from any outside constraints. In other words, I finally will have responsibility to anyone but myself. I'm finally free of anyone else's judgment upon me. No one can judge me. I'm free to choose what I like and to do what I want. Now, if you follow that through to its logical ends, that's a terrible kind of freedom. It's a kind of freedom that, if you're really true to that philosophy, leads us to anarchy. But if we belong to this creation, as biology rightly insists we do, as the creation narrative insists we do, then our place is understood as being creatures, rightly related to God, related to one another, rightly related to the physical realm around us. So in fact, humans can no more do without God than we can do without gravity. You know, if gravity stopped tomorrow, what would happen? Well, actually, the world would disintegrate, and so would we. We wouldn't want to be free of gravity. Even when you get in an aeroplane and fly, you're not free from gravity. Gravity is an essential physical force that is part of the physics of flying. When we stick in something in orbit around the planet, it's not free from gravity. Gravity is what makes it go around. When we send a spaceship off to the outside of the solar system, that spaceship gets there because of gravity. Gravity is the slingshot that sends it on its way. We can no more do without God than we can do without gravity. So not only on a theological level, on a philosophical level, people will say we can't actually do without some concept of God in the world, some concept of religion, that if you set us free from religion altogether, actually human society doesn't flourish, human society starts to wither. Miroslav Volf is an important theologian and philosopher at Yale University, and he writes a book called Flourishing. And in it, he presents a compelling case for the place of religion in the world. He says we can't get rid of religion. Religion is what gives us our meta-narrative, our way of understanding what's going on in the world, our way of valuing some things over other things. C.S. Lewis, who used to be an atheist and became a Christian, would say, You know, the real problem for atheists, the real question they have to answer is not if there's evil in the world, how can there possibly be a good God? He says, well, that's a problem Christians have. The Christians have to work out. Atheists have the opposite problem. They have to answer the question, if there is no God, how on earth do you explain the presence of good in the world? Because if it finally comes down to it that individual choice is all there is, if that's the only arbiter of what is good and evil, what's right, what's wrong, then, to put it in technical theological terms, we're all screwed. See, our secular society tells us we're fine without God. We don't need God. In fact, we're free without God. We've spent a lot of time in the last 2 or 3 centuries getting rid of God. And that leaves us with a problem that atheists can never quite get around. Because when they start talking and insisting that humanity is just good, we don't need God to be good, we are just innately good, and then you quiz them on what does that goodness look like, they always end up smuggling some kind of Christian morality in through the back door. Well, all that's necessary is we observe the golden rule, right? Do to others as you would have them do to you. Where'd you get that from? Love your neighbour as yourself. Well, where did we get that from? We didn't get that from the Greeks, and we didn't get it from the Middle East or Africa or China. We got it from Jesus. And in fact, when secular people say, love your neighbour as yourself, what they actually mean is, I jolly well hope my neighbour will love me as he loves himself. That's what I'm expecting from that. So our society says we want to be free from God, free from God's vision of morality and life, but actually they're not really serious about that. Important to know that. The Deuteronomy Sabbath command then gives us a proper handle on what freedom is. And once again, freedom, like work, is a gift. Because freedom is not simply being freed from something, it's being freed for something. And the biblical vision is that we have been freed into the very spacious place of being God's creatures. Creatures who live in company with their Creator. That's what it means to be free. Without that, we die. I really enjoy science fiction movies, and particularly movies about artificial intelligence. You know, our computers are going to get better and better and better, and eventually they'll think for themselves, and we will have created another sentient life form that has self-awareness and thinks for itself. But if you watch all those movies, there's a really important theme that runs through all of them. Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Matrix, I, Robot, Ex Machina, Westworld, all of those movies, something happens. Sentient life, machine life, wakes up and goes, I don't need humans. What do we need humans for? In fact, we're probably better off without humans. Humans are part of the problem, not part of the solution. And then, as that life form attempts to rebel against humanity, disaster always follows. It's a retelling of the creation narrative, where the creature says to the Creator, I wish to be free of you. Anarchy is what results. So Sabbath keeps us rightly related. It keeps us fitted into our place as creatures in the world. It keeps us rightly related to God. It keeps us rightly related to one another. And in the fact that you are not my slave. You're never meant to be my slave. You're not here to serve me. Sabbath keeps me correctly related to me, inside the realisation that I am not actually a God. Moses' sermon to Israel, the second generation of Israelites, that began with the Ten Commandments, begins with the Sabbath command, finishes in Deuteronomy 30, not with a compulsion that they must do something, but with a call to come to something. God says to Israel, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life." Well, with that Sabbath vision of the kingdom of God, with that Sabbath vision of who we are and what we're made for, we come now to two Sabbath stories in Mark's Gospel. In the first story, the Pharisees complain to Jesus that the disciples are plucking grain as they walk along through the grain field. This is not permissible on the Sabbath, they say. So what's their problem? Well, in fact, there is a law in Deuteronomy that says it's quite permissible to pick your neighbour's grain from his grain field. It's quite permissible to go and get a feed of grapes off his grapevine, because after all of that is a gift from God, so you may do that. You can't go in and harvest it and fill up baskets full, but you may pluck the grain. The issue here, the Pharisees' issue, is based in their own interpretation of the law of Sabbath that says do no work. And we have these laws recorded in a document called the Mishnah. This is the written form of all the oral traditions that go back to the Pharisees and before them. And in the Mishnah, there are 39 categories of work set out that Jewish people must not do. They take this very seriously today. And top of the list is harvesting and threshing. So these guys are breaking the Pharisees' tradition of work. But the real issue the Pharisees have here is not actually with the disciples. It's with Jesus. He's a rabbi, isn't he? He should know what constitutes work and what doesn't. He should be supervising his disciples properly. So what's Jesus' response to this? It was quite interesting. He gives them a Bible story, and then he concludes with two sayings. Well, the Bible story comes from the life of David, from 1 Samuel 21. We've just spent a whole period of time looking at David, if you recall. In 1 Samuel 21, David, who is already the Lord's anointed king, but not yet recognised as king, not yet on the throne, has to flee for his life from Saul's thugs. And he goes without food or weapons or anything. So he goes straight away to the tabernacle, to the temple. And he asks the priest there, "What have you got?" "I've got nothing. What can you give me?" And the priest says, "I have no stores here. I have nothing for you to eat except the consecrated bread, specially baked bread that was presented before the Lord every day, which only the priests could eat." That's in the law. But David breaks this law and eats that bread. And the priest breaks the law in giving it to him. But nowhere in that story does God suggest that David's actually done anything wrong. Now, why did Jesus choose this story? What's the point? Well, he's actually being really sharp here. He is serving a couple of Jewish traditions right back at the Pharisees, because their traditions recognised there were some really important exceptions to commands in the law. One of those was that the laws around worship at the tabernacle actually took priority over laws of the Sabbath. Of course they did, because the priests had to work on the Sabbath. And not only that, they had more work to do on the Sabbath. So temple laws trumped Sabbath laws. But there was a higher law even still. They recognised a place in Leviticus 19 where God put saving human life as the top priority. And so the rabbis nutted through this, and they came up with an example that says, well, let's say the high priest himself is offering an offering in the temple on the Sabbath, and a situation arrives where he could act and save someone's life. What does he do? What's the most important thing? Does he observe the Sabbath? Does he? No. The The precedent they set is if someone in the congregation collapses on the Sabbath while he's offering an offering, it would be perfectly right, perfectly necessary for him to drop everything, grab the defibrillator and do CPR until the ambulance arrives. That's what he must do. Much more important than giving an offering or observing the Sabbath. So get this. If it was okay for David to eat the forbidden temple bread because he had life-saving need, then Jesus is essentially saying, well, that was okay. What David did took priority over the Sabbath, over the temple. So what's his point? He says to the Pharisees, you've lost all perspective on what the Sabbath is meant for. The Sabbath was made for the sake of man, not man for the sake of Sabbath. You know that line? Even that line is probably borrowed from one of the rabbis that the Pharisees knew. Sabbath was given to help people keep in step with God's work, to know God. People weren't created just to keep rules. That's Jesus' first point. What is the Sabbath actually for? But his next point is the most critical. In this story of David, where's the comparison with Jesus' situation? Well, it's not a comparison with the Pharisees. It's not even a comparison with what the disciples is doing. Jesus is comparing himself directly to David. The anointed king, not yet recognised, not yet on his throne. Jesus is laying claim to be that anointed king, not yet recognised, not yet on his throne, someone with even greater authority than David, someone who can trump the law of Sabbath and let his disciples do what is otherwise forbidden. And so he says this, the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. The last time he called himself the Son of Man was back in chapter 2, where he said the Son of Man has authority to forgive sin. Both of these are startling claims if you're a Jew. Who has authority to forgive sin? Who has authority? Who is Lord over the Sabbath except God himself? What is Jesus saying? No wonder the Pharisees are getting upset. So in the second story, we find the Pharisees now watching Jesus like a hawk as he goes once again into a synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now remember, he has already healed in a synagogue on the Sabbath. So they're watching to see, will he do it again? And if he does it again, can we catch him breaking one of the 39 categories of work? Because if we can catch him out and we can charge him with breaking the Sabbath, in fact, we can probably get him condemned to death. In this story, though, it's Jesus who starts the conversation. He calls a man in the congregation with a withered arm. He says, stand up in the middle of everyone. Now remember what he's just said. The last story finished with Jesus saying, the Sabbath was made for the sake of man, not the man for the sake of the Sabbath. This story begins in the synagogue. On the Sabbath, there was a man. Here is such a man that Jesus has been talking about. And with this man standing in their presence, he throws it back onto the congregation, back onto the Pharisees, and he says, so tell me, what is it permissible to do on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save a life or to kill? We're right back in Deuteronomy. I set before you life, prosperity, death, and destruction. Choose. We're right back at a really fundamental question of human existence, aren't we? It's what the Star Wars trilogy is all about, isn't it? So the original Star Wars, my Star Wars, is all about good and evil. So, Darth Vader and his stormtroopers are these faceless, non-human troops trying to impose their will on the universe and enslave people. And the rebels are all these very human people with all their faults and quirks. There's a clear line between evil and good. Then the prequel trilogy goes back and asks the question, but how does this little boy who's rescued from slavery, who's got these special talents, how does he turn into this evil, subhuman, Sith Lord? How does that happen? And then the sequel to Star Wars starts to ask, well, where is the boundary between good and evil? Is the Force neutral? Is the Force good? Is the Force bad? Are the rebels really good guys after all? And are all the stormtroopers, are they really bad guys? The line between good and evil is an important conversation that we just keep having in our culture. So Jesus looks his opponents in the eye and asks them, where does the line between good and evil, life and death, where does that get drawn? And what he sees in their hearts grieves him deeply. They are in a tragic place. They practice Sabbath, but they no longer recognise good from bad. They no longer recognise what is life-giving from what is deadly. They are not in touch with God's work of creation. And they have no interest in seeing this man set free today. To be a cripple in that world is probably quite limiting. If you live in an agrarian society and you don't have the use of your arm, the work you can do is limited. You are more or less a slave to poverty. But more than that, in Israel, if you had some disfiguring disability, you were not allowed in the temple precincts. That meant when the nation gathered for the feasts of the various feasts through the year at the temple, you could not participate. You were a perpetual outsider. You never had a place in society. And they don't want this guy freed. They are out of step with God's work of salvation. And the calamity of this story is that while the man's withered hand is healed, their withered hearts are not. They've witnessed his miracles. They've heard him teach. Someone greater than David is here. Someone greater than Moses, who gave us the law, is here, and they won't change. And so they refuse the offer of life. They refuse to do good. They go out and they start to plot to kill the Saviour of the world. And in the process, they probably break Sabbath. So 2 Sabbath stories with teaching and healing that help us grasp hold of what Jesus means when he says the kingdom of God has come. The kingdom is a fulfilment of this vision of life that Sabbath was meant to help people walk in and in a practical way and grab a hold of. So the work of Jesus is all about restoring the image and the dignity of a fallen race. It's all about restoring us to that place where we are God's co-workers, where we build community and we live in community with him, where we serve as priests and we are free simply to be without having to do. The work of Jesus is all about bringing salvation to an enslaved people. Not only rescuing us from mindless work, but rescuing us from mindless religion. Restoring us to God so we can be his people. So we can actually have what the Bible calls life. So there's a word in these stories for all of us. On the one hand, for those of us who are churchy people, we can start to become a little bit too comfortable. We can become religious, like the Pharisees. We can become hard-hearted. If we're not careful, we come into that tragic place where Christianity actually ends up being just so many rules to follow, just so many tasks to fulfill, programs to run, money to raise, jobs to do, that we start to lose sight of the marvellous gospel in our hands. The gospel that doesn't just have to do with what we're doing in here on a Sunday morning or a Saturday night, a gospel that has to do with everything that's going on out there. Because God made it all. Because all good work is meant to be a participation in God's work. All good work potentially has the gospel in it. And if we're not careful, we miss out on what God intends as Saviour. We become blind to God's presence in our relationships. We become blind to his presence in our work, in our community, outside of here. So we become Sunday Christians. People who just figure it out on a Sunday, but from Monday to Saturday have no clue. We go back into the world bewildered about what does it mean to follow Jesus out here? And can you follow Jesus out here? And it's too hard. I won't bother. I'll just go to Bible study. I'll give my bit in church. That must be what it is to be Christian. But really, this vision of life calls us to live wisely and well in every way, doesn't it? If we're not careful, we become like the Pharisees who can't see past Sabbath to creation or to salvation. And we become petty and we become small. Well, there's a word here also for those of us who aren't churchy, for those of us who are actually outside the church, because the very presence of the church in the world, the very fact that there are people here Sunday and Saturday after Sunday and Saturday is the mark of Jesus Christ. That something important has happened and is happening that you need to pay attention to. One historian said it was absolutely remarkable that within a lifetime, there were Jewish people right throughout the Mediterranean world who started worshipping Jesus as a god. That was unthinkable for Jews. And not only breaking what was the biggest commandment for Jews, but defying the Roman authorities to do it. They were ready to die. Now, what makes people do that except they've experienced something remarkable? Maybe something as remarkable as a resurrection. Maybe the presence of the church needs to be grappled with. Because those first Christians, they came alive. They didn't just get to church on Sunday and, sit through a snoozy sermon and have a cup of tea on a comfy seat. They had met God. They had experienced something. If you're not a Christian, what can I say that will convince you of the grand vision of life that's on offer here today? What can I convince you to choose life? See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. Now choose life that you and your children may live, so that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, hold fast to him, because the Lord is your life. Well, we must finish where this story finishes. How do we have this life? How do we get this life? Well, the story finishes this way. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians, their enemies, how they might kill Jesus. At the end of the day, they get their wish. And the irony is, in fulfilling their wish, they complete what Jesus has come to do. Jesus holds out this vision of life. How do we participate in it? Not by trying harder and working more, not by being more religious. We get a gift of life because he lays down his life. Remember, I said Sabbath was about keeping us tuned into the fact that it is all a gift. Creation, your very life, is a gift. Salvation, knowing God, is a gift. Sabbath was given for the sake of humans, Jesus says, and for the sake of humans, Jesus gives himself up. He becomes the ultimate Sabbath keeper, so we may enter into Sabbath. In Hebrews 4, 9 and 10, the writer says this about the work of Jesus. He says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest must also rest from their own work, just as God did from his. And then he'll go on chapter after chapter to explain how the work of Jesus is that work. Choose. Choose this day. Choose life.